Welcome back to Development Dynamics with MaqC, featuring Dr. Katindi CV. And if you're catching us now, you really better go back to the very start of this story. An amazing story, lots of insights already. And Dr. Katindi, when you're describing your story, one of the things, especially when you're talking about futures, you mentioned two processes that have left me wondering and left me thinking. For someone who is probably not interacted a lot with futures, the Kenya process of the Kenya scenarios for youth, and this other one for Africa, and see what the differences were. And if you can take us through that, especially process-wise, and unpacking how does a scenario building process look like, and then in those two regards, what are the similarities, what are the differences, what are the sticky points, and what are the unique things that arose from those?
All right, that's a really good question. One of the things that we say in futures thinking is that no one has a monopoly of ideas. And also because no one has lived in the future, then nobody is an expert.
Unless you're a prophet.
Yes. But so what we do is thrive on what we call collective intelligence. And collective intelligence is really on an issue, bringing people of totally different perspectives into one room. So for example, in this case, in the first scenarios exercise, we were discussing demographics, youth demographics.
For the Kenya one now.
For the Kenya process. Even the Africa one. But so young people are experts because they are young, right? They are living the issues that we are discussing. But you're gonna find health challenges, you're gonna find work challenges, personal challenges. And so you have to have a mix of all those people, because you're not discussing, as much as you're discussing youth demographics, you're discussing what will life look like in the future. And so a balance of different professions, including unemployed ones, including people living in slums, including people living in affluence, that mix usually has to be in the room. Now, this is a bit different from what other professionals do, which is if you have a conference on health, you just invite the health experts. The danger with that, though, is that you don't have a cross-pollination of ideas. You really have, in a sense, what kind of inbreeding. Inbreeding. And so chances of you having...
preaching to the choir.
Exactly. Chances of you having innovative ideas really becomes
limited.
Slimmer. And so we're exploring together, and we are now bringing people who usually, again, will not come into the same room. So the beauty of futures thinking and this kind of process to inform development is that in the real world, these people coexist, right? And so you're only prototyping this at this workshop setting, where you bring all these people from different walks of life to have a conversation about different things. And because they're bringing in those lenses, those different lenses, it's very interesting, the outcome that you will produce. Now, in the Kenya process, one of the interesting things, and I think I attribute it to the fact that opportunities are very slim, and young people are many. So we held regional workshops, and because we could only pick 20 people per session, a lot of the urbanites who had the information figured out that they may not be selected for the Nairobi workshop. So they applied for the regional ones. And so while we managed to get good balances in other places, in Rift Valley, it was a complete flop, partly because we didn't realize until after the outcome that we had urbanites in the room. And so the scenario they painted mirrored the scenario that was painted by Nairobi. And that left us very confused, because we were like, it doesn't look right. Because again, in a rural setting like Rift Valley, even with its diversity and vastness, something needed to come out that was a bit more authentic than what came out. And so I actually gave this piece of work to a friend who happens to be someone I mentored. And he looked at it and he also disagreed. And he actually just sat down in the boardroom and wrote what the issues in Rift Valley are. And so that particular one we short-circuited in that regard. But it looked more authentic than the workshop that we held. So that was the interest. Those are some of the interesting dynamics. I did mention about, the conversations we had. Now, interestingly, Maxi, the first time I met you, you heard of this work and you brought in a younger group of urbanites from campus,
college,
I think.
Yeah, college going and just recently graduated. Yeah.
Exactly, because the Nairobi group we had was of much older youth that were already working. So we felt that perhaps we needed a youth voice.
That's
and
demographic that needed to be tapped
be tapped into, so that we also kind of check and do a cross analysis with what we are hearing to see whether the issues are the same. And so I remember we met over the weekends with the younger people, and there were a bit more reproductive health issues that were coming out with them, and the anxiety for unemployment than had come out with the older youth. So what then happened with this process, once we had that conversation, we then decided that we were going at the national, or rather this one scenario that combines everything, we were going to have representatives from all the regions. And I think, of course, we were looking at who understood the issues, who was active in participating, who was had got a good understanding and a grasp of the issues, and yet was alive to the issues that young people were facing. And so that selection process was done, and then we had a national group. The idea then was to then combine all these conversations and have a set of scenarios and we produced a book actually called Kenya Youth Scenarios, which is in short is Keys, and it's online. And then it does reflect the regional conversations, but then it culminates with an overall scenarios exercise that begins to say what really is the future when we look at the issues of young people. The interesting thing with them, and this speaks to by the way, in this Kenya process again, we actually produced what we call a research compendium.
All right.
And it was an academic type of piece that really documented in detail, documented youth issues. Unlike the fact book that just gave the data, the compendium just went really deep into, the stories, the history of these issues. And I think those three products, the fact book, the scenarios, complemented each other. And if you then want to begin to understand youth issues, I think that becomes an obvious starting point and to build on. And I think when I mentioned that this work did inform subsequent researches,
it's as a package.
It's because there was a basis for which those other conversations could take place, and then people could deepen. And I think in development, one of the things I would emphasize is the power of data and the power of research. Because, of course, we've seen how sometimes people will go to a place and they'll have conversations with people, and then out of that you do and how development has even worked in the past is that you have experts who don't even live in that situation but have book knowledge, designing projects for people, and those programs end up failing. So the classic example of any development scholar is one of these that was put in I think in every country I've had this story, where this missionary group went to a community, realized, an ASAL type of area, realized that these women travel for so long to go and fetch water. And they were like, oh my goodness, people need convenience, and the water is a necessity, it needs to come close to the people. And so they built, without consulting the community, built this well near, everybody, the proximity. And now they're like, we have done our good, tenda wema nenda zako. But when they came to evaluate the project later, what they realized is that the well was neatly, as was when they first launched it, and the women still traveled 3 hours to go and get water. And there was a peculiarity there that they didn't understand. And when they queried the community, this one fact, just a simple fact, came out. The women said it was the only time we have for ourselves and to catch up with the community gossip. And had they just taken the time to ask, probably they would have still done the same thing, And the community wouldn't keep referring to this well as the missionaries' well. Because people are still waiting for the missionaries to come and give them instructions, for example, on how to use the well. The point is that
that's very powerful.
Yes, involving people is important, but triangulating that with academic research and data collection, it brings in a power that either of them done separately doesn't.
So it needs to be it needs to be a package, and hence why recently, maybe not as recent as yesterday, but together, there's been an increase and a quest to then approach combine data together with problem-centered design.
Yes.
And data, so that then the solutions are centered on what the people are saying. In that example you've given,
but
for instance,
also
that's
you
a classic
have room
example.
to provide comparative analysis from other people. Because sometimes knowledge and even experiences are not, unique. People have gone through it elsewhere, and perhaps you don't really need to reinvent the wheel. In the Africa process, what was interesting is we were now bringing people of different countries. Right. So you are speaking of the north, south, east, central, so, and we need to understand the dynamics. So these are really major cultural shift in this particular piece.
Were there any West and were there any Francophone?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Great.
And so what we did is we started off actually with a field research on people answered a questionnaire about what different things about youth. And so we used that and complemented that with existing data to produce a fact book.
All right.
But the nuances that were it was very interesting to see that a youth in Mali is going through the same issues, just perhaps in a different cultural context, like a youth in East Africa or Southern Africa. And so that was interesting to see and to know. So one of the most interesting data, for example, I saw was on employment, where predominantly people said they went to school to study, let's say, business, or to study, just something, the usual studies that people have, right? But then when you ask the question about what would you want to do in the future, it was so interesting that what was available for people to learn wasn't what they wanted to do in the future, or what they were doing today in terms of career wasn't what they wanted to do in the future. So that was an interesting gap that we needed to wonder, how will it be filled? And those are the benefits of doing this kind of work using data and analysis, because then you're able to see the problem areas that you need to. Because one would sit down and say, we are professionals that have thought through education. But you see, when you ask the user, you're able to see the disconnect.
Exactly.
And maybe begin to then advocate for more IT-oriented, more... Actually, people now, interestingly, were interested in working in agriculture. And we were busy scraping off agriculture in the curriculum. People wanted to work in health.
Look at that.
And yet health is a profession that is given to a certain group of people based on marks, or grades. Based on grades. So it was interesting. And then there begins the question of, if you think about the health crisis, you think about the need of young people and reproductive health, which is rising, the need for community health, right there you have answers for employment. Now we are busy just saying that employment can only be fixed if we get people to do small businesses. Incidentally, young people actually didn't want to be business people, not in the sense that is designed in policy. They said, and we did ask the question, would you like to become an entrepreneur, or would you want to be formally employed? Incidentally, most people say they wanted to be formally employed, but they would prefer the formal employment to have flexible time and room for growth. And then this was going to be a precursor to them becoming entrepreneurs. And they were saying, we want to learn the tools of trade from established organizations. Then we can have the confidence to go and start businesses. I found that interesting because policy, the way it has defined entrepreneurship, their imagination is that young people are going to go on and do innovative businesses. But the way the mechanics of it is executed is that we're actually tooling very many young people, 90% of them, to start what is called household enterprises. Most of them are in retail. They barely have the capacity to employ. They don't have room to innovate. And so it's and we are oversaturating, the consumer market.
Right.
And so we are actually just moving the wheel and not really fundamentally solving that issue of unemployment.
Yeah.
Their vision of entrepreneurship is big corporations, multi-million-dollar corporations. It takes a lot of mentorship. It takes time to build something like that. And so those disconnects were glaring at us, and we're like, this is just obvious policy information that if somebody picked and designed a much better program, you're able to provide both tracks in such a fundamental way that you transition young people accordingly.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
So
the power of research and development.
You can't.
But also, a lot of people don't know how to interpret research into action. So there's action learning when you do research, and that gap hasn't been filled by a lot of people.
Research policy practice is it's a model, but it's also a huge gap. It's a huge
it's an investment.
It's
an
an
investment. It takes time.
Yeah. And it's currently it's still a huge gap in the market. From academia to practicing, it remains as a huge question mark.
But also because the way we've designed it is that they are separate processes. And not understanding that each feeds into the other, and that they are symbiotic relationships.
Exactly. That it feeds into the other, and it's a loop.
It's a loop. So that even as you work, you're giving. Right?
Yeah.
And so you need to refill. Otherwise you run on empty, and you can't give to the optimum. But the way the system works is that you're rewarded as a development practitioner for being an expert. And what does that communicate? That an expert knows and so cannot learn. Not cannot, but when you're called an expert, what room are you giving to learn, right? And that when you cease to be an expert, and yet for you to continuously be an expert, you need to keep learning. And that's why for me then, the gap I'm trying to fill in the work I'm doing now is to create those linkages that you cannot be a good practitioner without research, without then understanding how to interpret this research into workable action strategies, but then to create learning organizations that allow you to even experiment, fail, but it's part of learning.
Sort of almost rewarding
and investments.
Rewarding failure and rewarding learning.
Learning. And not failure out of negligence, but failure to learn and innovate.
For learning.
But people are not even willing to invest the time and the money.
And it takes resource
brain
investment.
Capacity as well.
It actually takes heavy resource investment for that kind of thinking to and this is a huge call to funders to actually probably
enable that.